Hey, this is IdeaCochise, Coach Rome. This is a movie review for The Dark Knight Returns DC animated movie, both parts 1 and 2. Okay, before I begin breaking down these two pieces of one story or movie, I want to give an overarching thing. One, this is a story based off a comic book by Frank Miller back in the 80s, and that's something I'm going to have to really get into later on in this review, because it's very, very deep in its symbolism of different characters. Secondly, this comic book of the 80s is actually very similar to another comic book of the 80s that was matched up in a movie 1-to-1, and it kind of shows the flaws of trying to make stories fit different mediums of how they're portrayed. You know, not everything that works in a comic book could work in a movie. And this is one of those, unfortunately, even though it's entertaining, especially part 2, is unfortunately one of those kind of issues, one of those kind of stories where it just doesn't work that well in the movie setting. So the first part of The Dark Knight Returns is basically, it's set in the future, 20 years in the future or something like that, but it's still very, very 80s. I mean, you know, what Bruce Wayne does is very 80s. You know, he's doing NASCAR, the big threat of the Soviet Union. It's to say that, you know, people in the 80s thought that we'll still be fighting the Russians, or the world will end sometime between, you know, 1980 to like the year 2000, you know, when the whole world was going to end. In the 90s, we thought that bullshit too. So I forgive them for that, but it's still very, very 80s, even though it takes place in the future. What I wanted to say about there's some things they do when it comes to 1-to-1, and the first thing that you're going to pick up on is the language, because what Frank Miller tried to do within his book of The Dark Knight Returns was make this like this new slang, like I'm jib or some stupid ass shit like that to all the, you know, riffraff say. And the thing is this, I think that this story could have been done a little bit, this movie could have been done a little bit better, not the story, if it just took the essence of what the story was about. American Psycho was a fantastic adaptation from book to movie, because even though it could not do everything that the book expressed, that Patrick Bateman, the main character of that book, done, because it's just way too violent, it got the essence of what needed to be said and what needed to be conveyed to the reader or viewer. This is more in line with The Watchmen, and let me get back to my notes here. You know, like I said, they both take place in the 80s, and there's always this looming threat of the Soviet Union. It's never the, oh God, shut the fuck up, dog. It's never the main threat. It's never the threat that's more visceral. It's always this looming aspect of what's going on in this, behind the scenes. You always have this aura of a nuclear attack that's going to take place somewhere nearby, and it always ends up taking place, god damn it, it always ends up taking place, you know, somewhere far away from where the main characters are at most of the time. So when, you know, they do this in these type of stories, and you'll notice that most of these kind of stories of the 80s that talk about the Soviet Union, they make it seem like they're the looming threat, but then in all honesty, when you look back and really read deep into the text, that it's America being the only threat against Americans through the fear of reactionary issues that Americans go through, or the Western civilization goes through dealing with the Soviet Union. And that's exactly what this story was really about. The first part deals with Batman's psyche and, you know, what makes him tick, why does he need to come back to be Batman. One thing I'll say, there was a huge benefit with the movie in terms of storytelling, that they do a lot of exposition, what goes on around the world and how the people are feeling through little news briefs on TV. When you read in the comic format, it's so long, and the artwork is a very unique style. I'm not going to say it's bad, it wasn't for my taste, however, but in the motion format, the animation format, it was superb. I loved that. I loved how they just got through, you got a lot of information in a very, very short period of time through news briefs. And so therefore, it just sped everything up. You knew what the general consensus of those who live in this universe, or the Gotham City for that matter, felt at any given time through that. So that was a very, that was actually a plus in the animation department. On the surface, it seemed as though, and I'm still talking about part one, where everyone who's not Batman or the Joker, someone who's really good and really evil, seems to be like a weak-minded bystander or a blind faith follower. This goes to the different games that were portrayed within part one and part two, because there's this one game called The Mutants that's slice and dice. I don't know what made them want to transfer that on to the audio of the actual movie. It's fucking stupid and very distracting. They have a leader, and then Batman beats up the leader. Then they all just stop being bad and follow Batman. And then there's in part two, there's the group again, and they have like, you know, there's ideas of there's been other different leaders. They just keep changing and changing over and over again. Someone named I forgot, there's some Nazi woman who has a shirt off with 2 swastikas on her chest. It was in the story, and it's 1-to-1, so of course they have to do that. But another thing that really comes out as a huge distraction to this film, or both of them, is how many times Batman is shot at and never gets hit. And I know this has happened all the time in other Batman comic books, movies, cartoon movies, or whatever. The amount of bullets thrown at him in these 2 movies, especially the second part, is fucking ridiculous. It really is. And you're supposed to take the fact that Batman's older and slower, he's a little more lethargic, and so he should be able to dodge all these things, but god damn it, it's like, how, you know, it really kind of takes you out the movie, especially there's a couple of times where he's getting shot at, and the gun's right here, and the person pulls the trigger and just goes click. Like, there's no bullets again. So, once again, it's one of those kind of things where you can accept it in a 4-piece miniseries comic book, but it's very, very difficult to accept that in a very fluid motion animation such as this one. You know, he only gets shot one time, and that's by the Joker, who seems to be this dead-eye sniper, because he's just popping a lot of people on throughout the movie. And I'm sorry for the spoilers, but I mean, the story's fucking over, getting on 20 years old now, probably more than that. Shoots Batman one time in the rib cage. The scene was excellent. I like how they did that. One thing about the movie is that it did have a good atmosphere to it in terms of, like, you know, how they frame things, and along with the music. The music is the same from part 1 to part 2. The music, it was good. The atmosphere was good, like I just said. But yeah, just Batman just getting shot, like, well, the lack of Batman getting shot really kind of takes you out of the film. And when you're talking about the psyche, that you talk about Batman is so crazy, he's so mentally strong that he weakens he weakens those who are already weak-minded to either follow him, which is the case with Robin, or go crazy, which would be something like the Two-Face, Penguin, Joker, Scarecrow, any of those kind of guys, because they're like kind of trapped in this Batman membrane, like they all like kind of feed off of each other somehow, which in some ways it kind of makes a little bit of sense, but the second and the worst part about it was it makes that Robin, the way that she's portrayed in both the book and in the animation, seem much more like a victim rather than someone that Batman needs to, you know, calm his mind or lighten himself up, or just as an assistant, because, you know, they have this doughy-eyed girl, she becomes Robin. You know, she helps out Batman in part 1 and part 2, like, you know, saves him from, you know, passing out or dying on the street or something like that. But she doesn't really do anything. There's no, like, character development. She just sees Batman and becomes Robin, and you really start to think, like, well, how different is she from any of the people that the psychiatrists who are against Batman or create all the supervillains that he created? How different is she from them? And both stories provide no answer. So it actually makes Batman seem really more like a perpetrator, a perpetual perpetrator of what goes on in Gotham City. Now, going back to this being very 80s, and one thing about the 80s, for those who didn't grow up in it, it was a very strange time in terms of you had these two ideologies. You had the corporation. I'm talking about, like, from you know, the beginning of product placement in movies, propaganda against the Soviet Union, the beginning of disinformation between the mass media to the public when it comes to like issues concerning conflicts with America, and either it's siding with its allies or dealing with the conflicts, or why we were needed in different countries. We had no idea where the fuck they were geographically speaking. You had that, and then that created a bunch of different subcultures in the 80s. I mean, this is how punk rock and rap really got created from these underground levels. I mean, everything in the 80s, you're either corporate or you're underground in terms of like how you viewed the world socially speaking. So this book is actually taken from that kind of time period, and it's very similar to today. However, there's no music or artwork that's actually really being promoted dealing with underground stuff. There's just a bunch of underground people who want to be corporate now, and corporate people trying to act like they're underground in different forms of music, such as rap or you know, even certain pop stars today. So you have to take this into context, because if you don't, a lot of things are going to fly over your head. And the main thing, speaking of flying, is in part 2, the introduction of Superman. Now, when Frank Miller wrote this story, I don't know if he intentionally did this or not, but he made a satire. It was a very evil, bardic nature against Superman to make him look like a fucking dumbass. He's a super powerful being that you see in earlier parts of the film. You know, he getting shot, he uses super speed, dismantles people, stops missiles, can survive a direct nuclear explosion, and for some reason or another, Batman defeats him. And you think like, well, how the hell does he fucking do that? Oh, because Batman's cool. What a lot of people don't understand, and I don't think if Frank Miller truly understood what he was doing here, was that Superman in this context is a symbol of American interests. You know, he's a symbol of American interest in the terms of like what he's willing to do to protect it, and this sort of disillusionment of who he needs to protect outside of his given context. If you look at it in that sense, Superman makes a lot of sense to use it for Batman to actually ultimately go against, if Frank Miller's feelings towards America during that time is voiced through Batman himself. Sorry, let me look at my notes again. So yeah, Superman was a character that was really designed to show how Americans lie about their actions being served for greater good, however they're being manipulated by a higher power, and that being then President Ronald Reagan. So if you understand these kind of things walking into this movie, I think you'll enjoy it on a much, much deeper level. If not, I would probably have to say skip part 1, because part 1 and part 2 are not really that strongly connected. I think part 2 has a lot more action. It gets a little bit more down to the point very quickly, and the psychological issues that Batman had that played a factor in his return in part 1 is mildly interesting, but you know, just by looking on the cover that Batman's older and he's coming back. So really the journey to that destination is not the most interesting, and I just actually don't really feel that it's overarching. You know, he has like he's talking to Bats in part 1, and he never seemed to do anything like that in part 2, and it's just like, well, but did you just get over it or something like that? All in all, I would recommend you buy part 2. Part 1 if you want the full complete story, but I would really wish you just put this all like on one disc. One thing about this, I'll say this, because I had to watch this back to back, because part 1 came out back in November 2012 and this came out in January 2013. There's not a lot of wasted minutes in this. If you watch it back to back, it's actually, there's stuff going on all the time, and the majority of it is very integral part to the story and to the lives of those in like the Gotham universe. Because to me, Gotham always seemed like a place that had its own feel to it. It wasn't like, you know, the Marvel version of New York City or Metropolis. Gotham is very, very gritty. It has all these different social economic structures to it. Did not feel like it was wasting any time. It felt like everything that was leading up to something. It's just that there was different things leading up to different things. The conflict between Superman and Batman at the very end. Once again, if you know something about the 80s and what Superman's actually supposed to represent, it's okay, but just taking it off the surface, it breaks down on its own comic book logic. So that's my review for The Dark Knight Returns, both part 1 and 2. Please subscribe.